Quick introduction about Sandbox Solar. Started the company about 4 years ago with a business partner, AJ. We entered the CSU Powerhouse Energy Institute and started at a desk about this size, working next to each other, and have grown to 3 crews and a couple sales guys. And most of our business has been residential. Probably 85% of it has been residential installations, including home batteries and electric vehicle charging stations. We've also done some commercial projects, including right across the street in situ. There's a carport right over there with electric vehicle charging stations. So next time you drive by Odell's, take a look at that, and that's a pretty awesome project. AJ and I have always had interest in innovating within the solar energy space. We always had a keen eye for community solar. And community solar, of course, has a lot of hurdles, not only political, but also just land use-wise. Obviously, land in Fort Collins is very expensive, hard to come by. So finding land space to develop solar projects can be a very big challenge. If you try to go to the commercial rooftop route or the carport route, those have its own challenges between risk to the real estate owner or just having a big enough financial incentive for solar to pencil out to have the real estate owner listen in to develop a solar project there. So that combined with new innovative technology in solar energy and batteries has sort of made AJ and I push further into other realms to develop specific niches in solar. And so the route that I've been most interested in, focused on in our part of the business, has been sort of what's developed into agrivoltaics. I'll explain a little bit about that further. But what was also another driver was interesting, what passioned me. So I went to school in central New York, in Syracuse, New York, at the small school called State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So in central New York, there's a small town right nearby called Dryden. And Dryden, New York is a very rural agricultural town. And Dryden, if you don't remember, was one of the first ones in national news lines to put a moratorium on fracking and oil and gas. So very liberal town right by Ithaca, New York, very progressive minded. Well, years later, solar developments became more popular in the state of New York. And a solar developer approached the town and proposed a community solar garden. And the town was totally in uproar about community solar penetrating their market. And the reason for that was they had this image of industrial solar plants taking away agriculture producing land, taking away this rich biodiverse forest land. And so it really caused a lot of upheaval for these residents to potentially put a moratorium on solar energy. So here you have this forward-thinking rural area that also doesn't want solar, and that's not in my backyard. So it really accentuated the battle between solar, sort of the land availability for farming and for solar. There's this essential competition between the two for these in-between spaces between suburban areas and rural areas. So that also drove a passion to kind of change up the land use model a little bit. So agrivoltaics is co-locating agriculture and solar. So that can mean a ton of different things. That can mean, I'm sure you've heard sheep grazing with solar panels. That's a very common method that is exponentially being used across different solar installations across the US. Pollinator habitat in solar gardens is another huge one that NREL, especially Minnesota, has developed a lot in here soon in Colorado. Another great use of developing our agricultural resources with solar energy. And it's all about sort of this permaculture mindset of combining water efficiencies, land efficiencies, and food efficiencies, and energy resource efficiencies, and trying to make them all come together in one. Another good example is wind farms have been so successful. That's because wind farms have been able to partner up with these rural cattle ranchers and had been able to co-locate their systems with these cattle ranchers, which has, I think, increased the adoption for rural areas to produce more renewable energy. So the way we're looking at agrivoltaics, what I've been interested in is actually co-locating the production of specialty crops. So specialty crops mostly means like your vegetables, kale, spinach, tomatoes, peppers, onions, anything that you buy at the grocery store and consume. And hemp is actually included in specialty crops as well. Other stuff that's being agricultural stuff that's researched at CSU, like your corn, wheat, alfalfa, those are not considered specialty crops. So those are more industrial commodity crops that are not within that umbrella of specialty crops. So you can see in this picture, there's our solar array, fully developed, and we have one of the research assistants driving a tractor right in front. So our pole mounts can actually be adjusted at any point via screwdriver or a drill and be tilted from 90 degrees to 0 degrees. So it allows for this tractor to pass by and not damage the panels and then put them right back up. So the idea of agrivoltaics was mostly started research in the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany in the 1980s. They came up with a theory, well, if you had 1 hectare of just 100% of one crop, or a hectare of 100% solar, you could sort of try to compete those two resources and extract the max amount of either. But what if you think about it in terms of efficiency? If you use that same hectare and and co-locate the two, but get 80% production out of both, you're almost doubling the production of that land use. You're sacrificing some of the efficiencies of either resource, but you're maximizing the amount of resource production from that single plot of hectare. So this is just another example of theory of agrivoltaics. So at the Fraunhofer, they actually raised the panels up to above a combine level. And so they're actually able to run a combine underneath these solar structures. Of course, these solar structures are so high up, they're probably higher than the carport to bring these huge 16-foot high combines to run underneath. So it takes either a massive amount of engineering and material to construct that, or you need to be in a low wind zone area like Germany to derate a lot of that structure in order for it to be feasible. But with that demonstration plot, I think it really showed the maximum potential, even on the industrial scale level, of the possibilities of agrivoltaics. So some of the benefits of agrivoltaic systems that we've seen that really drove this research even further to beyond what we imagined was we saw a significant increase in the soil moisture retention. Of course, in Colorado is a semi-arid environment, so we have really dry heat. And when the sun is baking the soil, the water that was dripped and irrigated on the soil, it evaporates really quickly. So with the panels shading the actual agriculture, it reduced the need to water by 3 days. So every third day we could water the crops rather than every single day. This year we also saw a significant amount of hail protection of the plants. I think this is a huge value to the agriculture because we noticed instantly that the tomato plants that were underneath the solar panels were completely unharmed by the hailstorms that we had, versus the tomatoes that were in the wide open spaces. They were hit back really hard. Some had died out, or some had been put back and looked were 2 weeks behind normal growth rates. So the hail protection was huge for the agrivoltaic systems. Diffuse light for the hottest part of the day. So we really saw that, so let me go back a second. So plants typically only use about 50% of light per day to actually photosynthesize and produce crops. And so that is significant because over a certain heat or temperature, these plants have way too much light, way too much heat, and actually go in a protective mode and try to shut themselves down and prevent any energy losses. So the actual shade from the solar panels actually reduces the intensity of light and heat on the plants. And so some of these fruit qualities actually prevented sun scalding or dry out and other damages to the plant itself. Of course, agrivoltaics produce localized energy. So there's potential to either electrify our farms even, our tractors, other farm equipment. But there's also potential to create an abundant amount of sustainable resources and supply that to the farm, local township, or even potentially sell it back to the utilities in the area. So we're really looking how to scale agrivoltaic systems up to overproduce on these plots of land. Potential season extension opportunities. So what's interesting is these panel coverings during the mid-seasons, probably a week or two ago, when we first had that first frost, the panels actually protect from dew dropping down the plants and freezing the plants. So the plants that were underneath the solar panels were actually protected from the first, I think it was the first or second frost. So it actually extended the season of some of the plants a little bit, which is huge for farmers in terms of continuing crop production and growing out their plants throughout the season. And the plants behind the panels, they actually absorb some of that heat and light. So it actually, we're finding that the temperatures underneath the panels produces a microclimate and actually keeps the panels cooler throughout the day, which is huge for solar energy production. For those of you who don't know, each panel, especially silicon panels, they have a heat coefficient. So when they heat up too much, their efficiency significantly drops down. So these microclimates improve the efficiency of the panels as well. So how did we get started? At first, I had a bifacial solar panel. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with bifacial solar panels, they're similar to the typical solar electric panel that you see, a monocrystalline or polycrystalline 60 or 72 cell panel. But instead of that opaque backsheet that you see, that white area in between the cells, it just has another sheet of glass instead. So you have glass on glass with cells in between. So in between the cells, you actually have free, clear, transparent space that lets light pass through. So it's almost like this checkerboard of light that passes through the panel. And a lot of research, these panels have been developed for the reasons, for mostly utility and tracker scale reasons, because they're starting to find out that you get an albedo effect. So you get a reflection of light bouncing out from the backside and bouncing and hitting the backside of the panel. So throughout the day, you get bonus production, which some of the module manufacturers are predicting up to 40% added bonus production from just that albedo effect. So I was curious, if we have PV production bonuses, is there enough light, even in just these bifacial panels, to produce crops? So I contacted Dr. Mark Uchansky. He's the professor of the Specialty Crops program at CSU in the horticulture department. And I brought this panel to him and said, hey, Mark, you think we could grow anything under this? And it's the middle of winter. And he thought, oh, no way. There's no chance in hell you could ever do this. But what the heck? We're not doing much this winter anyway, so let's give it a shot. So we brought the panel to the greenhouse at CSU. and just propped the panel up via string and just had it hanging there. And we put some seed starts and some soil trays of some spinach plants. As you can see, we had one trial session straight underneath the solar panel, one sort of halfway in between, and one in full sun, and just kind of compared the differences. So as you can see, all the seeds started even straight underneath the panel. They grew out. The spinach underneath the panel actually fanned out, the leaves fanned out and tried to capture more energy, so the leaves of the spinach actually became larger. You can see the fresh weight per plant. Full sun still produced more fresh weight per plant, and there was slight diminishes in the weight per plant after being shaded. But the dry weight per plant stayed very similar in the partial shade. So there weren't significant efficiency loss in producing underneath the panels. So this was enough to go to lovely CSU Energy Institute, and they had some additional funds and money to hire a CSU intern for the summer. So we procured all the panels. We got with Mark, and we had Tom, who's our research associate for the summer. We brought the panels out there, set them out just on cinder blocks. They're only about 2 feet off the ground. And we grew as much as we could underneath those panels that summer, and just to see if during the summer days what kind of results we would get. So this was last summer. This was conducted at RDEC South. 3 different panel types. So we had 2 bifacial panels that were tilted at different angles. We had just a normal monocrystalline panel, and then I'll show you in the second the CAD-TEL 50% transparent panel. So as you can see, this is the bifacial panel that I was talking about. You can see this checkerboard of light passing through. So there's actually some light passing through the whole day, and the shadow moves across the whole day, and you'll get some light and some shade on all parts of the plot. This, you can kind of see it a little better. I think I'll have another slide that shows the CAD-TEL panel a little better. But you can basically see right through the panel, and has it's almost a shadow. It's a very light shadow. You can see right through it, and there's tons of light that passes through this type of panel, which is very unique. So from that research, I'll have data later on to show you from that research project, but essentially we found anywhere between 75 to 97% yield of different types of plant underneath the solar panels, including all those additional benefits that I listed before. So we got significant interest from our field day at CSU, from other professors at the horticulture department, and Mark Uchansky. So we ended up using that research to apply to a USDA Small Business Innovative Research Grant, which we ended up getting awarded last April to conduct a full-scale study and actually implement full pole mounts that you saw earlier at CSU RDEC, and have research assistants at CSU conducting full scientific research on the agrivoltaics concept, the specialty crops, and also part of the grant funds for us to do a market scale study, market research on the potential in the state of Colorado, and also develop a business model and intellectual property that will hopefully advance agrivoltaics as a niche in the solar energy industry. So the specific USDA grant that we won was specifically to benefit small and mid-sized farms. So as you can imagine, most of these mid-sized farms are organic farms that you often see, a lot of CSAs. And we interviewed a lot of farmers around the area and had awesome letters of support, awesome letters of interest due to the concept. So certainly there's a lot of skepticism in terms of risk management and not losing your crops and not buying into something that could potentially harm the amount of produce that they produce for their members every year, because they do have an obligation to their members to produce every year. But they have shown significant interest that if scientifically this works, it makes total sense to reduce their carbon offset, reduce their energy at their farm, while also producing crops for their members. So immediately after getting our grant awarded, which, may I mind you, was supposed to start, go figure, the USDA grant was supposed to, the range was from July to February 2020. Now, how you're supposed to get a growing season between that time period, I have no idea. So, luckily, Sandbox Solar as a business had some money funded away and could front some of the money up and start developing the project right away, knowing that money was coming in later. So, procuring the equipment took about 2 months, from April through May. And then early June, we finally started breaking ground, digging the holes, pouring the concrete. We had to move the dirt as well. There was a lot of subsoil that we hadn't thought of during construction, so we wanted to move the subsoil away because it's not nutrient dense anymore. So we had to shuttle that away from site. We had to be careful about compaction of the soil. So especially with the heavy equipment they were bringing in, we had to lay like boards around each hole and make sure that the weight was distributed amongst the soil, so that because if you crush down the soil too much and get compaction, the roots of the plants are not going to be able to penetrate the soil as easily. So this is probably towards the end of closer to the end of the construction. We use these pole mounts that are really handy. You could build them right at your hip level, hoist them up, tilt them up, and they have this self-adjusting tilt that I was talking about that raises it from 0 to 90 degrees. So that was a huge aspect of the equipment selection. There's 12 plots total, so we wanted replications of 3 of each test plot. So we had 3 control groups, just open land. We had 3 monocrystalline pole mounts, so the opaque panels, to see how that would compare to the semi-transparent panels that we had. So we also had 3 of the bifacial ones that checkerboard of light, and then 3 of the CAD-TEL semi-transparent ones. So afterwards, after the pole mounts were mounted, we got to the actual agricultural side to actually play farmer and till the land and plant the row crops and see how everything produced. So as you can see, we were able to run tractors in front and behind, not only for tilling but also laying plastic beds. And this is Tom right here tilling up the land a little further where it's compacted more and maybe a little harder to reach. But we did build it high enough, about 5 feet up, to actually have a person standing underneath the panels and actually operating, while at the same time low enough to maintain sort of the wind zone capacity, so we didn't have to make these huge concrete piers that were already bigger than this. These were 2 feet diameter by 6 feet deep. So that's the wind loads we have in the state of Colorado. So this is the study from a drone. This is the plot here at Ardex South. These are the high tunnels they grow tomatoes in. You can see the plots were randomized in random order. And you have the bifacial monocrystalline panel and the CAD-TEL semi-transparent panel that you can even see right through from this high up. So looking to next steps, our goals for next year are to implement more pilot projects. So we want to implement more different conventional styles of solar installations, all the way from potentially we're looking at dual axis tracking systems, of course, east-west tracking systems, potentially north-south backtracking systems. to kind of actually play with different conventional styles of solar installations and see how we can modify them slightly for agrivoltaics, and then kind of gauge the farmer's response from operations of that years of growing, and gauge like the effectiveness of the light passing through these different operations and seeing how the crops respond. As you can imagine, there's so many different variations of type of crop, type of irrigation, type of row cropping, spacing, height of panels, that it's hard to choose just a few. So we're hoping to install about 10 kilowatt systems in 2020 to kind of test out different variations and pick and choose ones to customize even further to pursue in agrivoltaics. These were the results of that 2018 study that I showed you. So this is the chard, and this is the lettuce grown underneath the cadtel panels, the monocrystalline panel, the bifacial panels that were tilted at 35 and 25 degrees, and then the control. So as you can see, those cadtel panels produce almost equivalent to the control as same with the bifacial panels. So it's very similar in terms of productivity. So that's what really excited us to apply to the USDA grant. We'll have results here. We just finished harvesting of the rest of our kale last week at the plot for this year. So we'll have results in probably about a week or two for this year's study. So I hope to make a press release on that and have that further published for public viewing. So keep an eye and look out for that. This was a study done by Oregon State University, completed this year. They took a grand scoping view of the potential of agrivoltaics, and they went ahead and looked at irradiance levels compared to land cover types across the whole world. So they looked anywhere between snow and ice, forests, oceans, shrublands, wetlands, and croplands. And basically the summary was, between the medium and the range, they found that croplands have the most land potential area to actually produce solar as well. They have the most solar potential to them. As you can imagine, our ancestors who grew crops, obviously they were looking for the most land with the most solar potential as well to grow their crops. So it sort of only makes sense that that's what they ended up finding. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I got my card here if you have any more questions. If you know any farmers, we're looking for pilot projects to implement, so please send them our way. So thanks for coming tonight.